I love the noise canceling feature so much that I'm like addicted to it now. I just can't believe it. It's amazing. It doesn't like cause some weird problems. Anyway, um, so with the invasion of the Ukraine, um, Ukraine, it's always like, nobody's really acknowledging. I mean, everybody's acknowledging it. People are going on with their lives, and that's healthy and that's a functional thing to do. Me as a person who's just read media articles since I've had the internet. And I didn't get the internet till, you know, steady use of the internet until about maybe 2002. But I've pretty frequently been reading about Putin. And the reason had to do with I like to read about um, technology breakthroughs. So I've been reading some of the fringe technology breakthrough websites. And they would always have something like battery progress innovations and, synthetic gasolines or something like that. Solar panels, percovicites, I can't even pronounce this stuff, but technological innovations. But at the same time, every time it seemed like Europe or America was moving toward green energy, renewable energy, hydro, geothermal, wind, all these solar, gravity batteries, all these different technologies, it seemed like Russia would do something destabilizing, usually in the form of some weird aggression, you know. And like I'm not, what is the word, police science major or anything like that. I don't have a very good understanding of historical geography or geopolitical issues. But, I'm just kind of a child of the 80s, and I remember, Gorbachev and Reagan hash things out. Our media mocked the Russians folding, the Soviet Union collapsing, because I don't think our media cared for Ronald Reagan. Well, they didn't. They didn't care for him at all. And the fact that he sort of bluffed with this Star Wars special effects propaganda stuff, we didn't need to rub it in Russia's face. I just farted, and the noise canceling thing actually canceled out the noise of my fart, which is pretty, definitely useful. Like if there was something like that to cancel the odor of flatulence, that would be pretty terrific, but I don't think there is. So what happened is, in the 90s, I remember just watching stupid, the train whistle just blew too, and it got canceled. Anyway, there was movies, there was Rocky, the Russians were villain and devices in movies and pro wrestling. So for a kid in the 1980s, it was pretty well understood. Russians were presented as malicious, and not entirely. Like you would see some good, uplifting productions featuring Russians, meaning to kind of bridge the worlds. There's a famous Night Court episode. There's a lot of things where, people really did try to make efforts of goodwill, gesture in media. But somewhere in the 1990s, our news media very frequently, or kind of noticeably frequently, mocked the Russians or the Soviet Union caving. Um, and I think that had to do with animosity at Reagan, is what I think. So in the modern day, so what happened for about 20 years, maybe longer? I've been watching Putin just because we were all kind of indoctrinated in the 80s, which was sort of a retread of the 1950s, to pay attention to the communists and to pay attention to the Russian Soviet Union. Um, so what happened was just from that conditioning, I would watch Putin and try to just read about them. I didn't understand them. I didn't take the initiative and really try to read about it. But over the years, there's been articles. A dog. He sicked a dog on Merkel, the president of Germany, and some things look really bizarre. He's in a YouTube where he sings Blueberry Hill um, with an African American band, and I've always just kind of been watching media pieces on him to try to get a sense of him. I really didn't have one until negative things started happening. There was the concert that got shot up in Germany with the Kalashnikovs, and there was the Georgian invasion. George Bush said he was a good guy. Putin was the first one to call after 9/11. That was a little bit weird, but at the time seemed like goodwill. But everything about that 9/11 was very strange. So the fact that he got on the horn first, I don't know. But it was not really possible to ignore Putin too much if you were trying to read about innovation and fuels, technology breakthrough, because it would just seem like somehow it would overlap. Like, I don't know why it seemed like he would push back on that stuff, but it seemed like there was always media trolls, and there is now, in comment sections, saying things like, well, there's always going to be oil. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? The main motive is always energy independence. That's what the motive is, to not need to rely on OPEC, not need to rely on, Middle Eastern countries or Russia. Not rely on anybody. Just be sovereign. Not even rely on Canada. And what has happened is we do have a certain amount of oil, but that oil, domestically, that oil requires processing. And that creates a lot of pollution, and you end up with a movie like Dark Waters, where you got people in the South displaying what looks like some type of neurological problems from being around, gasoline processing and chemical processing. There's a lot of chemical processing in Russia, we're told, in media, and that can be adverse to the population because processing fuels is a big deal. Processing chemicals is a big deal. So what happens is whether or not electric vehicles are safer in terms of the industrialization, it's a real question. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But at the end of the day, you could not have to rely on other countries for fuel. And while it is a little bit of an eco concern to strip mine the things like cobalt and things like that, the reality is you could probably at some point replace the cobalt with other more abundant elements, and you might be able to engineer materials like plastics instead of some of these rare earth minerals. So things like that, energy independence is extremely important. But it seemed like for 20 years, it seemed like Vladimir Putin was pushing back on that. And I've lost my train of thought a little bit, but it's always interesting when you comment on social media to try. I wouldn't call myself an activist, but I've tried to participate in the discussion online in social media for some of these eco efforts, some of these planet renewable energy efforts, for two reasons. One, they might be beneficial. They might cut back pollution. Even if there isn't global warming, which I don't really understand, there's a lot of exhaust emissions in big cities, and some of the air quality closer to the refinery and processing plants is maybe not the best. And you get into an issue of affordable housing, being able to afford a home that is not around a processing plant. That's important. because you're damaging people's health if you're building homes around processing plants. So that goes a little bit beyond job creation. And I do think renewable energy would create the same amount of jobs ultimately, eventually. But right now you have these people saying, well, think about all the jobs that will be eliminated if you were to switch off of fossil fuels. I mean, switching off of steam engines probably eliminated jobs, but steam engines didn't generate the amount of wealth that fossil fuel has generated for the people able to gain access to those natural resources. It's generated a lot of money, and those oil conglomerates have been able to probably influence government and probably to some extent suppress the technology infrastructure. I'm not a chemist, but I got an Instapot. It's got pressure cookers. Some of that energy is not extravagant usage, and a car could generate it with friction braking and electrons, that stuff. I don't think it depletes. I think you excite it with heat, and a car can generate a fair degree of heat due to friction. Um, and wind drag, I mean, in a hybrid format, a moving car can do a lot, and stationary power plants can actually do quite a bit. Gravity batteries due to ancient technology of hoist and pulleys. So we kind of have the ability to do more than we do, and, it's a big cash grab. The oil industry is a cash. Now, I'm not saying it isn't, helpful to have oil as a product option in cold weather states, the Northeast being the major one. I'm sure Canada certainly needs it. But, there's times of year where you don't necessarily need to even burn off the oil. Like you can probably heat it up to 300, and then, because the boiling point of oil is 300 degrees, and that can get quite hot. And if you were to stick, you can do that with friction, friction braking, you can heat up oil to its boiling point, just under its boiling point, to like 250 degrees. And then you can stick a conductive piece of metal in there. And if you're telling me that conductive piece of metal, pressurized or, heated up off that 250 degree oil, can't excite electrons to charge your battery? And another thing is, well, they'll say the battery, they make the batteries big. And in terms of engineering, I don't know that that's the greatest thing. Because if a big battery explodes, it's very dangerous. Whereas if you have smaller batteries, a lot of them, that might be less dangerous. Because they're not likely to all explode at the same time if there's an emergency. Odds are they'll explode at separate times. And the smaller the battery, the lesser the danger. So that's why my concern has always been with whether, renewable energy has gotten the respect it deserves and the effort it deserves around the world. And Russia makes a lot of money off of oil. I feel our population has the ability to push back against government and push back against stalling technology quo. Capitalism does allow for that. Sometimes there's a real, intimidation in trying to do that. But, I remember when the iPhone came out, I didn't get an iPhone for a very long time. It's 2023. I only got maybe an iPhone in the last 5 years or something like that. It made no sense to get one. But iPhone was the first phone that could put music on it. And it was almost like people sort of understood if you could make a nano iPod, and you could put it in a phone, and they didn't really want to do that, despite the fact that nano iPods were pretty cheap. And it took a while for those two things to be integrated, and it's only because the public really demanded it, because it made sense to the public. Hey, why can't you just have music in the phone? You can make an iPod, you can make a nano iPod. Why can't you put that in a phone? I don't want to carry 15 different gadgets. I have reflux pretty bad. And what happened is, in a span of like 5 or 6 years, Steve Jobs gets it done. And then shortly after that, he dies, which is it's tragic, bizarre. I don't understand it. But a man that rich to not be able to, get a treatment that would deal with his cancer. I'm not trying to belittle the health risks of cancer, but maybe that's a different rant, because it seems to be a vaccine type of situation where you could make a vaccine to deal with cancer, but also they understand now it's mitochondria, and if you can kind of reset mitochondria or kind of soothe it to not be so, troubled, there are probably different approaches you could probably do. And the delivery method for these healing genes is apparently a virus. So they have the word epigenetics for how the body changes in reaction to a virus. The thing about cancer is, like, you don't necessarily need to do a treatment that has permanent effects. I'm not an oncologist. I don't know. I'm talking out of turn because I have a camera. But it seems like what they could do is they could expose the body to a virus that has a gene that doubles up on maybe a gene that's having a problem, and they could maybe inactivate a gene that's lashing out. These people are a million times smarter than me. I went to a high school where I was pretty low in terms of the intelligent people in the high school. And this school had, several thousand kids. And I would say about 60 to 75% of these kids were extremely intelligent and capable of critical thinking. And, this was in the 1990s. So the idea that conceptually there aren't people out there, and this was just one school. This wasn't like an Ivy League school. But the idea that there aren't people out there who know how to apply the technology correctly to address some of these diseases, because it's their mitochondria, and mitochondria has been understood probably for centuries. And viruses. The Russians have been using phage technology for hundreds of years, I think since the 1800s. They didn't even want to deal with Louis Pasteur's, the guy who invented the vaccine, the Salk. I think I'm forgetting the name of what the virus was he defeated with this vaccine, but basically there was the West went towards vaccines, and the Russians went towards phages. And I think both are functional and helpful science. But, there was something to be said for the Russian side, and there's something to be said for what the Americans did with the Salk vaccine. I'm forgetting the name of that disease that he was able, I think it was polio. But that may have been where it all started. But the thing, ranting about Putin, it's just because the guy's been affecting other industries. He's been affecting the energy sectors by destabilizing the world. And the oil industries are in breach. They've not upheld world stability. And frankly, it's probably antiquated technology. I'm not saying it doesn't have use in cold areas. It's a terrific option to have. I lived in a home that used oil for a period, and oil was more efficient. It was absolutely the way. But that gets into another problem. Oil is single-celled organic matter, and that stuff could be cloned. You can make that stuff with molecular gene engineering. You can, somebody used the analogy on TV. It's not yogurt. You can't culture it, but you can culture it because scientists made a sheep. They cloned a sheep in 1996, and the Chinese manipulated DNA like about 3 or 4 years ago, a baby's DNA. So if you can manipulate multi-cell DNA, certainly you can make oil, which is not, it doesn't have a nervous system, it doesn't have a lot of these other things. It's not radically different from making cheese or something like that. And at least it's decaying fossil organic matter. But if you're going to tell me there's no ability of modern science to speed up that decaying or to make it decay in a specific way that takes on hydrocarbons, that is extreme. I'm just incredulous that that's not within the range of scientists who made a sheep. They cloned a sheep genetically to be the exact same different sheep. That's manipulating an animal. An animal DNA is way more complex than decaying matter, because there's just little organisms eating the decaying matter, resulting in hydrocarbons. So not just has it been an issue of delaying electric vehicles, which if you understood chemistry, I think they can excite those electrons via heat and friction to make the cars not too dependent on grids. The cobalt is a question, but chemists these days are absolutely brilliant. I mean, they're just trying to make a conductive piece of plastic or a conductive metal, a cheap, abundant conductive metal. They even use silicon is what the thing is now, but they can probably use something better. They say cobalt is the real problem, but they can probably add electrons to God knows what, aluminum or whatever, manganese, God knows. They can probably make that stuff now. But even in oil, if you look at the Wikipedia, if you look at the breakdown of what's in the oil, it's magnesium. It's basically abundant elements. There's nothing in there that's super exotic. So it all seems like it's been a grift, which, a lot of businesses are a grift to some extent. That's not really the sin here. It's not really great, though. It's gaslighting the world population. But the bigger problem is once it's broken down into national borders being violated and a new land grab and genocide by the West, like Russia doesn't identify as the West because Putin doesn't identify as the West. He's the East. And even if he is the East, I think we could civilly work with Russia if we didn't have, China, if we didn't have an instigator in the form of a tyrant who just wants to sell the world oil perpetually, even though it's awfully close to antiquated science or technology. And that's what I think has brought this to a head for decades. It's just money. He just wants to sell oil perpetually. I don't think anything else is genuinely a problem. It's just competition for revenue. And, the guy says he hates globalists. He wants to be a globalist. He wants to export oil and he wants to export minerals and the wheat, the food. So, and he wants other people at a disadvantage. And so that's why I've been reading about him, because I've been trying to read about the progress of societies around the world in terms of technology for, probably 3 decades now, since 2002 when I got steady internet access. And, it's always been timed where Putin would have some sort of outburst or there's been some sort of terrorism as people tried to move towards renewable energy. That's been the impression I got. So if I seem like I've been fixated on Putin for decades, like that's why. Because he's just kind of come up in the reading I've been trying to stay on top of.